Welcome back to another video. If you're a country that relies on agricultural exports, the last thing you want to be doing is starting a trade war with your biggest customer. But that is exactly what Donald Trump has done. And you could argue that he's well, you can't argue, he definitely has. He's upset a lot of the agriculture and farmers that actually voted for him. And that's because of the trade war between China and the US. Now, one of the largest imports into China from the US was agricultural products, as well as energy. But this video, we're going to talk about agricultural products. And a big portion of that was soybean, wheat, and beef. And I'm putting a sort of story up on the screen now that one of the American farmers has suggested that he will be out of business by 2027 unless Trump changes his policy on tariffs, because what's happened, it's pretty much stopped the export of a lot of these agricultural goods from the US to China. And something really interesting, let's take soybeans for example. Well, China are switching, they have been for a number of years, but they're switching now even more of their purchasing to Brazil. And China are the largest soybean buyer in the world. And previously, approximately 50% of the soybean that America produced shipped to China. But that has been declining, and it will decline even further. I would suggest that China have a strategy to shift most of their agricultural purchases now away from the US because of the US's what China think are unfair trade practices. But something even more strange is going on. The price of soybean is falling, which actually suggests that there's no problem with other countries meeting China's demand. So it's going to be the US that are left with a lot of soybean on their hands. And not only will they find it difficult to sell, but the price they can get for it is also dropping. A number of soybean farms are also experiencing situations where it's costing them more to grow and process that soybean than they actually get for the soybean. But that's not really down to the tariffs. That's really down to that Brazil and a number of other countries are now doing a lot more trade of grain between themselves in the BRICS bloc of countries. The BRICS nations, those were the founder countries. More countries have joined, and they're doing more and more trade now between themselves. And a lot of those BRICS countries account for quite a lot of the grain production in the world. So they're trading amongst themselves outside of the Western and the US system, and that's meaning that the US don't have eyes on what's going on either. And then if you look at beef, China have rumoured to have just signed a huge beef deal with Australia, and they will become less reliant on US beef. Now, if you go into any higher end stores here in China to buy steak or high quality beef, it will either be American USDA beef, or it will be Australian beef. And I suspect that more and more now we will start to see less and less American beef and more Australian beef. And this is really a big problem for US, because I think even if trade tariffs by Trump are relaxed, I don't think China will rush back to start buying those agricultural products from the US unless it's part of a trade deal. I remember in the first Trump term, part of the trade deal was that China buy specified amounts of agricultural product from the USA. And I actually think as long as US can be competitive on price, China wouldn't have a problem with that. But what's more so happening now is that the cost of US agricultural goods is becoming much more expensive than other nations' agricultural goods. So it's getting not as attractive for China to buy from the US, because the costs of US agriculture and grain is rising, where in other nations it's falling. And that's because a lot of the input costs into US farming have increased, machinery and this trade war, you know, any parts of machines that say, you know, John Deere use, they will now be more expensive. And of course, that cost will be passed on to the farmer. So I think it's kind of unlikely that, you know, China will go back to buying a lot of agricultural product from the USA. So I think US farmers are in for a pretty hard time unless they can quickly start finding some new markets for their grain. But we have, like, Russia increasing their grain supply quite considerably. You know, it's moving from Europe, where it used to go because Europe has sanctioned it. It's now coming onto the market in other countries, which it wasn't before. So that's also at play here. And I just want to touch on another thing here. So overnight, Trump has said that he hinted that China have reached out to the USA to make a deal, and he keeps talking about making a deal. Now, he keeps saying that, you know, many countries are wanting to make a deal. There's no evidence that a few countries. He's just met with Italian Prime Minister Meloni, and I believe he has something lined up with the Indian Prime Minister. I believe he spoke to Vietnam and a couple of other countries. But this where he says, you know, that the world are falling over themselves to talk to him and do a deal. I really don't buy that. And I certainly don't buy that China have reached out to the USA to make a deal. I will really call Donald Trump out on that one, because I know from being here in China the feeling, and I know that 100% the Chinese will not bow down to US demands. And in fact, the last time that China initiated a call to the USA was just after 9/11, and that was to offer condolences. And every time ever since then, it's always been the US have reached out to China to initiate a call. And I don't think that will change. I don't think China are the slightest worried about not having the US as a customer. They've planned for 8+ years. I was at the Canton Fair yesterday, one of the major trade shows here in China, and the sentiment I felt was that, you know, we are moving on. You know, there's a big world to supply. We're not reliant solely on the USA. Anyway, you let me know what you think in the comments down below. But as always, for now, take care.